Hello, everyone. Welcome. I hope you can all hear me. Hello, welcome, everyone. Welcome to this week's masterclass. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just before we start, a quick reminder that we're doing these masterclass sessions every 2 weeks on Wednesdays at 5 p.m. UK time. So you're welcome to join us anytime you'd like. And also make sure you're following us on all of our social media, where we share all of our upcoming events there. So for today's session, our guest is Catherine Alexander. She's an LSDM alumna, and she did a master's in design with us. Catherine is the founder and creator at Color Academy. And for today's session, we'll be discussing the topic visually communicating the psychology of color. If you have any questions or comments during or after the presentation, feel free to share them in the chat box. And in the end, when we open the session for a quick Q&A, we'll read them all. So thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you, Catherine, for accepting our invitation and for being here with us today.
Of course, I'm excited to be here. Should I go ahead and start sharing screen?
Yes, please.
There we go. Okay, so I'm not sure what everyone's kind of creative field is that's on this call, but as almost everyone in a creative field understands and should understand is that color is a vital tool to communicate a message. But what my experience and ultimately this research showed is that it can just as easily become a distraction from the intended message, and it could confuse the audience. We are given or presented a color palette, or we give one to a client or they give it to us. And most of the time we really just kind of stop there and we don't give context for how the color should be used or why the color was even chosen. So I worked as a fashion and color trend analyst years back. And when I did work in this field, I really pored over trend reports and forecasting reports, which developed my understanding of intentionally using color to communicate an emotion. In this niche industry of trend forecasting, you don't just forecast the shade, let's say of red or green, that it was going to hit the retail market in a few years, but rather we analyze and predict the emotions of the future consumer and connect that back to a color. It will best reflect that emotion. And we use mood boards and videos really to connect or to showcase this connection between the forecasted color and the forecasted emotion. So visual communications is really about performance, and that is the performance of a deliverable or the end result. And that comes or is measured, so to speak, when the desired message or the emotion is successfully communicated or created in the audience. So as a product and brand designer, or any kind of design work that you do, we really need to communicate a message to the design team or in your trend report or to a client, for example, using maybe a mood board. So from my experience, again, there was really no better tool than through a mood board to communicate these messages. It could be a digital, visual, physical, any kind of there's a lot of different ways to utilize a mood board, but again, it's implied in the name, right? If the mood's not communicated, then it's not a successful product. So why did I choose this topic for my research project? Well, a few years ago, I gave a lecture on color, or basically kind of an intro of color, how to apply color psychology to a class of undergrad students. And I pulled up these two images that you see here of with the red object on it. One, of course, the pile of shiny red apples, all similar to each other. And the other, the singular red apple with the dark background, the leaf kind of a little bit more what I thought was intrigue. And I asked the class which image best represented love, intrigue, and power. Again, all common emotions associated with the color red, and when we use the color red for a palette. So I assume most students would pick the singular apple set against the dark background on your right side. But much to my surprise, pretty much every student picked the pile of red apples to communicate love, intrigue, and power. Interestingly enough, a lot of the older individuals in the class that were sitting in on the class all picked the singular red apple, like I myself assumed a lot of people would pick. But this simple question really unexpectedly turned out to show the innate contextual differences with which we view color and when we react to a single image. And so Furthermore, if one of these images, say, was the sole advertisement or marketing kind of product or deliverable for a brand message, then these students and adults really represented a conflicting message and a conflicting response. So there was not enough visual context to push the variety of audience members into a singular intended emotional direction. So if context determines how we interpret visual communication, visual stories, or even color, as shown from those two apple photos, then there is not one blanket way that we can use color to communicate a message. It's not as simple as blue means this, so we use it to communicate this message. And as a visual communication designer or brand designer, or just a designer at large, we really need to understand this concept, because we cannot guarantee as closely, or we need to guarantee as closely as possible, that the audience's emotional reaction is what matches the final work or what was intended to be communicated. So the aim of my study really sought to understand, again, how to successfully use color to communicate an emotion and to guide a viewer to an intended response, namely through a mood board specifically. I first looked at historical meanings associated with colors and the context that has framed these common associations. And then looked into visual communication methods used to successfully push an audience to a desired response. And finally, bring together common methods or overlaps between context and visual communication methods. My hypothesis, so from experience and preliminary research, I really understood that there are factors that impact how everyone interprets color, and therefore we cannot rely on color alone to communicate a message. So say using green for a branding palette or a logo design, for example, it's not going to just guarantee a unified message if we just slap green on a business card or the back of a website. Again, there's no guarantee. And more specifically, I hypothesize that there should be patterns that emerge in how an individual responds to color palette versus a mood board. That may be given an additional visual reference that should push context and should push the viewer kind of to a deeper understanding. So as we all know, that color is really woven into every aspect of our daily lives, and in actually more ways than we probably realize. And it's imperative to understand the foundations of color itself for this research, how we use color and what impacts the way we see color. So again, it's not enough just to say, well, green means nature and red means love. So those are the colors that you should use for this project. But if we can understand common associations with these colors, then we can use the historical associations and things in our work, and to kind of let the audience or the client know why we chose these colors. We also live in a globally connected marketplace, as this call, we're all over the world right now talking to each other. So clients can range in geographic location, yes, but we can also, even if they're your neighbor or live in your apartment complex or your neighborhood or wherever, that we can all range in cultures and traditions and color associations. And so for diverse viewers, just like in that class I taught years ago with undergrad students, for diverse viewers to arrive at the same end message, we need to include cultural context to help the viewer understand, again, deeper meaning of color. We have to make sure we include all that context in our work. So why specifically did I use mood boards for this research? Well, for my literature review, let's see, in Paul Lester's book, Visual Communications, he references the idea that it is the mind, not the eyes, that understand visual messages. So if our mind sees what it wants to see rather than what our eyes actually see, that's what he's referring to, or he talked in depth about. So visual cues such as color, form, depth, and movement are all noticed before a person realizes what, in fact, they are actually seeing. So in the end, a mood board should be or is a single image created from a collection of images, objects, and photographs. And the goal is for the audience to pick up on the visual cues, on color, form, depth, and movement that will persuade them towards a specific analysis and understanding. before leading with this research and kind of as I was deciding what to do, I saw a gap in research done on this topic, which confirmed to me that there was space to push further into identifying how a designer can use traditional meanings of color psychology alongside visual communication techniques to really invoke specific emotions from an audience and for a project. So I used both so by using both historical research and the themes of visual communications, the mood boards were developed and created using images to build up the context. The creative process used for this research began with a color palette for a specific brand. I kind of worked backwards a little bit, and then I chose the colors that I wanted to work with, and then built a visual brand story for different mock brands. And then finally a mood board was produced. And these color palettes were developed, again, for all these brands that I'll talk about in just a minute. So the color palettes and the subsequent mood boards that were created using two methods. The first one was to test if one color palette could tell two visual brand stories and garner different emotional reactions. So again, one palette to tell two different stories. And the second method was to observe if the audience reaction to a color palette could possibly change from negative to positive or from positive to negative as the context changed. So two common and widely used colors, green and blue. And then I used two well-known, but not widely used colors, brown and yellow, for the research. So for both blue and green, common associations are mostly positive, but they can still conflict in meaning. We can all have different associations and kind of responses to the color, even though they're mostly positive. And on the other hand, for brown and yellow, again, multiple emotional reactions to the colors, but they are more polarizing and kind of change more easily between positive and negative. So this is the first brand that I worked with, Floral Hues. And here on the left, you'll see the branding guidelines, the keywords circled, brand purpose filled out, some inspiration images for a brand, and the color palette that was developed for this brand, tonal palette of greens. And on the right side, again, an industry standard brand guideline that you would probably send to a client or you would receive as a designer with the logo, the font, and a color palette. So this is the second brand with the same tonal green palette, but different keywords have been circled, different brand purpose outlined, and different inspirational images. So again, same color palette, different brand story. Repeated the same method from the green for the blue palette. So this is the first of the blue palettes for a brand named Commission. Again, keyword circled, brand purpose outlined, and inspiration images for this tonal blue palette. And then here's the second brand for the blue palette, Friendfolk. So once again, same palette, different brand identity or brand story. Then we see a color palette for this particular brand, Birch Moss. And again, this was going to be used to see if I could change reactions from a palette when context is provided. And then lastly, the color palette of yellows and chartreuse, which again is quite polarizing in and of itself. So for this brand, to see if we can change perspective with keywords and brand purpose on the left, and then the brand guideline on the right. So this brings us to the mood boards that were created for each brand or for each palette. These mood boards were created, again, to develop context and visual identity of these brands. So I used the same methods to build each mood board and included that at the end of my research paper. Again, kind of step-by-step guide of how to actually create mood boards such as these. So here's the first one, Floral Hues. And the second green mood board used the same color palette, but told a different visual story for a different brand. The blue color palette, based on color psychology, would traditionally be used to communicate a calm, peaceful story. And the first brand and subsequent mood board really reflected that delicate, calm, peaceful brand identity. And then the second blue mood board, again, using the exact same color palette as before, but a more casual, relaxed, not as feminine brand story for friend folk. So the psychology of the brown and yellow palettes, again, vary greatly from one side of the spectrum to another. The brown palette for Birch Moss was subtle and, dare I say, bland upon first glance, possibly, but the mood board was designed to provide context for the branding palette and possibly flip a response from boring to maybe more elegant and interesting. And lastly, the yellow palette, again, similar to the brown, and then it could create conflicting or negative reactions. But for part of this brand identity, tried to or incorporated luxurious draping and formal images to tell this brand identity story. Whoop, skipped page. Nope. There we go, the survey. So the survey asked participants to pick words that best describe the 4 color palettes and then pick words from an identical list to describe the digital mood boards. There was no set numbers to how many words they could pick. It was free. You could pick as many or as little words as you wanted. And they were all mixed up, meaning it was not the yellow color palette and the yellow mood board, then the green palette and the green mood board. They were all kind of mixed up and intertwined. The survey's main goal was to help, identify which step in the creative process was more successful at triggering an emotional response through visual communications. There was lots of observations from the survey and from the feedback. Overall, participants chose significantly more adjectives to describe the mood boards than they did the color palettes, which directly supported the objective to see if context helps guide the audience and form a deeper emotional reaction. They had more associations with the mood boards than with the palettes. The majority of participants also reacted or chose more adjectives for 1 or 2 palettes than another palette or 2, which for the palettes with no context provided, most likely identified a personal preference to these colors. If you didn't like that color as much, you didn't really have much to say about it. You didn't click as many adjectives. Calm was chosen for the blue palette and the mood board 87% of the time. Organic or earthy was chosen 78% of the time for both the green palette and the green mood boards. And friendly was overwhelmingly picked for both the yellow color palette and the yellow mood board. And all of these were significant observations because they support traditional color psychology meanings that we have. Again, when you just look up, what does blue mean? A lot of these were just kind of innately picked from people. There was support for the hypothesis of being able to change a person's emotional reaction from negative to positive. So for example, one person said the yellow color palette was bland, but that the yellow mood board was dramatic. Another participant said the brown color palette was earthy and bland, but that the brown mood board was calm, timeless, and graceful. Again, being able to change someone's reaction just by providing context and visual references. So 2 men who filled out the survey provided feedback that they were colorblind and they had a hard time identifying the color palettes, but they did not mention the frustration was related to the mood boards. They didn't complain about the mood boards at all. So this observation really supported the hypothesis, again, that color viewed with an elaborate context can benefit the visual story, even if the color shown is not seen as intended. So visual context, again, is a powerful tool to push the audience towards an intended visual message. And the survey really did provide the data to support the hypothesis. So the human reaction to color has been studied extensively. There's amazing research that's available and out there, and it's been applied to all kinds of different businesses and industries. But this research really sought to identify if context could gently force or intentionally guide an emotional reaction when communicating with color, even when people did not realize they were being kind of pushed into one way or the other, that you as the designer can intentionally guide them to have the reaction that you're wanting. So one specific takeaway from the observations was that additional context would benefit the intended message. In the case where 2 mood boards were created for the blue color palette, more contextual references were needed based on the adjectives that were chosen for the audience to kind of understand 2 separate brand stories. There was not enough difference in the mood boards. So with this in mind, in the research, I included some ideas for additional contextual references that could be added onto each mood board. So for the first blue mood board, again, layering in delicate details and things that reflected the brand guidelines or the brand purpose from the branding outline at the beginning of the research. And for the second blue mood board, it could benefit from adding wood tones and tactile threads that speak to, again, the craftsmanship of this brand's visual story and further separating it from the story of the commission, the other blue color palette. The yellow mood board, which sought to change any initial, what I assumed would be negative reaction to the color palette to positive emotions from the mood board, could again benefit from more luxurious details shown here in these photographed flat lay images. And the brown mood board could also gain depth based on observations from the survey of tactile hand-carved wood pieces set along delicate linen and block print textiles, as you see here in these images. As with all research, as you start asking more questions, there's a lot of more ideas of ways that you could continue this research or have further research. And so one idea that came to be was to present mood boards in person to an audience versus digitally, as this survey did, and note the differences. If in-person tactile, where they could interact with the mood board, would help someone have a deeper emotional reaction as well. Also, surveys that focused on specific ages or demographics would provide great new data points. And all of these mood boards were intentionally created with similar overall aesthetic, but creating multiple mood boards from the same palettes, just as I did with the green and the blue, but with extremely polarizing aesthetics, would also be fascinating and help provide interesting data as well. So at the end, I also included an application section in my research, which I mentioned earlier, that showed how to actually create these mood boards and the method which I used for them with step-by-step guidelines. And I also included examples of how these images could be used, very practically speaking, for these designs or for these brands, excuse me. So as a designer, what do we do with these findings? How does it benefit us? Well, how do we actually apply these to our work? So as shown here, started with the brand guideline from Friendfolk on the left, developed a palette, image of the mood board set against the logo, and then applied the images of further context to images that would be used for marketing purposes on the socials or website, etc. Again, kind of the progression. So here the progression for birch moss, all of these examples, again, both of the digital mood board and the flat lay were physically photographed objects and how they can be used for marketing purposes versus just putting one of the palette colors behind the logo or on a social post. That if you use images that provide context, that it will really enhance the audience reaction to your brand identity in this case, or to whatever project you're working on. And lastly, here's the development through Studio Collective and how these images as examples could be used on social platforms as well. So the research showed us that the first reaction to a color palette is most of the time based on personal preference, and that mood boards in this case then help to guide the audience to using even more visual cues and context. And the individuals were able to identify even more adjectives and verbal commentary for each of the brands in the survey. Visual communication seeks to define how we interpret and process visual images around us. And therefore, as designers, we really need to, or should want to use any opportunity we have to guide and impact the audience's view and interpretation of these visual images when we're specifically communicating with color, or we want color to help our end product. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you for sharing your work with us. We will now open the session for some questions or some comments. If anyone wants to participate, you can just open your mics, or you can just write your questions or comments in the chat. In the meantime, I want to thank you once again, Catherine, for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for sharing your work with us. I can say that for me, it has been a very insightful time, and it's really interesting to see how one's perception of colors and opinions can depend a lot on the context. It's really fascinating. So does anyone have any questions or any comments?
I'll say something. In response to what you're saying, with one is the designer to use context to kind of push an audience into a different, or into one specific reaction, but also then on the flip side, as a consumer, when we see colors being used, it can help you understand, what are they trying to communicate to me? And is this a message that they want me to communicate, or is this an original thought that I have? It really kind of gives you a new perspective when looking at projects and palettes, as someone gives you.
Exactly. I'm seeing here Mafalda says that.
I have a question. I was writing, but I can ask myself. So, Catherine, first of all, thank you for your presentation. It's always a pleasure to have former students to presenting their projects regarding colors. And I'm a fan of all the studies regarding the meaning of colors in design, in marketing, in communication. From the marketing aspect, at least here in Europe, we see very oftenly the red and the yellow associated to sales promotions. I'm thinking mainly in the retail sector. But what I see as a consumer, not as a marketeer, is that even that, which is almost like a paradigm, is changing. What is your opinion on that?
Yes, I think it's an interesting observation that perhaps as a consumer, we're used to seeing the same thing. So the marketing teams are trying to stand out even more from the general consensus, right? If you use a red for or sale or clearance sign, we almost don't even see it it doesn't stand out anymore. And as we walk by, so you're trying to stand out from something that has just become such the norm for us. So I think that it could be why people are trying to kind of now do their own, bring in other colors to stand out. Yeah, interesting.
And one of the comments or questions or curiosity that I have is, as a designer, you most likely had to deal with some client that was not liking the color that you were proposing, although it was a meaningful color with an object or with a goal. So how do you tackle this when it comes in a meeting or in a presentation of work? How do you manage this? How can you tackle this issue?
Right.
I don't know if
that's a great
I
question.
believe it. I believe it already happened to you a lot.
It has. If you have to convince, say, the chartreuse color palette, if you just say, here's the color palette, here's what I recommend, and then they're going to say, well, why? So if you have done the research behind it, and you can, kind of set up your defense as to, here's why I think this color would work in this case, and here's the associations I have with it, you open up conversation with the client to, well, that's a really great kind of historical reference we'd love to work on, but are there other colors that are associated with that historical reference as well? Or you open up, there's a lot more conversation that can be had if you give all of your contextual background to a color, say, versus just, oh, I like this color, or this color to me speaks because it means this one emotion. But the more, again, the context you provide, there's so many different avenues of conversation you could have that I found from working with clients.
But you never had a really difficult situation on your
Not specifically where someone just, well, this is just,
Okay.
I mean, I think everyone working with clients has had situations where you're like, well, that did not go as I thought it would go.
I
And you have
don't like this color. I understand that, but can you please try and
right. Or, okay, well, here's why I chose it. Do you like the reason why I chose it? And we can find a different color, or does the reason not match up with your, what you see for your brand either?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I see Anna has raised her hand. Do you have a question? You can open your mic if you want.
Yeah, thank you. Hello. Well, my name is Anna. Maybe it's some music background because I'm in a coffee shop. I am from Peru. So thank you very much for the masterclass. They have been very useful information. And currently I am working with traditional artists here in Peru from native communities. So one of my goals is to promote their creations and textile and accessories that they create in these native communities all around the world. So I was wondering how to be aware of the meaning of color in each market. For example, if I want to promote some art pieces in Europe or in the United Kingdom, the preferences and colors for this specific market. So maybe you can share some bibliography tools or methodology that I need to be aware of. So that is the question about. And thank you very much.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm happy I can put my email here and I can research some books or different references for you to, look at for historical references. One book that's very, it's called The Secret Lives of Color, that is a really quick, kind of fun read of all these different historical reasons that we associate color with different things that could be interesting. But I'm happy to send or do some research myself and see if there's any other great resources for you as you research in different countries and cultures.
Thank you. So Secret Lives of Colors. Thank you. I can leave my email. That is what I understand. Sorry, yes?
Yes, no, yes, I would love to. That's the book off the top of my head, and I need to go back and, read my list of references for you, but I'm happy to send, do some research and send you some ideas.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. I see that Amber has raised her hand as well. You can go ahead.
Hi, yeah, good morning, good afternoon. I had a question. Thank you for the great presentation, by the way. I really love the showing of like the mood boards and the tones that you can change with just a few pictures. Kind of how do you tackle something where you come in and it's an existing client with an already set color palette and they say, well, we don't know what we want to do. We've never really thought about this, but we want to convey something with these colors that we've kind of already picked out.
Yeah, I'm sure that's extremely common of these we're not changing the colors, but how do we utilize them better? I would say that you really have to work on the context with them as to, okay, you try to almost work backwards, similar to how I worked on this research I had the palette first, and then I kind of created these brands based on them, and then worked forward again and came up with the mood boards to tell the story. So in a way, really trying to understand the brand that already has this palette, and then how can we connect this and make this very intentional that they've used these colors, and be open to, at that point, your research could really go any direction, and you kind of just, does that make sense? Create the intention as you go is what I would recommend.
Thank you. That's great.
And now, Vicky, you can go ahead. You also raise your hand.
Hey, hi. Congratulations on your presentation. I liked it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I wanted to ask, if you have a client and you are the designer, you have to collaborate with the marketing team and the client. Okay. And you can see sometimes it happened to me in the past. The marketing agency had an opinion A, the client had an opinion B, and you as a designer, but while you're following the theory of colors and you say you have to use red here, you have to use yellow here, you see there is a conflict between the departments, and you just don't know how to handle the situation. And the question is, do you think the designer needs to follow the marketing department or the client preferences, or how would you deal with a situation like all of these three departments, they have a conflict maybe?
In that case, you're kind of like the marriage counselor trying to get everyone to work and get along with each other, right? I do. I years ago when I worked for an accessories company, globally known accessories company, it was that all the time. It was really a tension between here's what we're saying is going to be the trend. There's trends that we're forecasting, and the designers applying it, and then the buying team. It was always this very kind of struggle between the departments. And I think that unfortunately I would say there's not, you always follow the client or you always follow the marketing team. It's a balance, but as the designer, if you are so secure and your understanding of why you're choosing this color, and you can really have a defense for it, so to speak. So if you can have this, the marketing data to say, well, this percentage, kind of have the business side of why you've chosen this color and the contextual references for it. You really set yourself up with as much evidence as to why you're choosing the color. And then, in the end, you can't really you can't change people's minds completely. You're not in control of that. But if you have every, the stack, excuse me, of why you've chosen it, again, as if you're going to court and you have to defend it. That's how I've always approached those conversations. And at the end, if they still don't go for it, that I know that, well, I presented a lot of evidence as to why you should, and you chose not to listen, but I can't make you listen.
Thank you. But do you follow if they say, a client say, no, I don't like the red here, and the marketing says, yeah, we have to go with yellow here, but you're the designer and you have proof and you showing them your research about, or other competitors, maybe you did a competitive analysis or whatever you did, and you're showing them like, guys, look at that, these results, and they say no. Do you follow still their opinion and are you making something based on their preferences, even if it is not going to be the right one in your mind?
I think there's a compromise for sure with all designers in all creative fields. You have to compromise, but hopefully come to an agreement in the end that something that really makes the client happy, because they're going to come back and bring their business back to you, and that everyone kind of be on the same page. And of course, you have to compromise on stuff that you're like, oh, I really think this would have been a better option, but okay, let's make this work, and here's how we can utilize it.
Thank you so much for your response.
It's a global struggle. Every country, obviously, we have this.
Yes.
Yeah.
If I may add something regarding my experience as the marketing department in previous companies, and I completely understand what you are feeling as a designer, and I think that the best option is always prepare yourself for the meetings, have a strong rationale, because if the marketing team is a good marketing team, they will understand the rationale beneath, and they will try to work with the client to make sure that we are doing the right option or the right selection. Mm-hmm. Of course, there's and now from my point of view, of course, it's always best to work with designers that are able to reach an agreement, because I believe none of us has 100% sure or right of the decision. So I think it's good to have this balance between the teams. By the end of the day, it's a stakeholder management. It is. But it's always the best solution for me is always to partner first with the marketing team. Make sure that you are on the same page so that when you go to present to the client, you have an ally.
Yeah, I guess that's good. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I don't know if there's any more questions. I see that Anna and Amber wrote their email here on the chat. I can put you, if you want, in contact with Catherine, if it's all right with you.
Yeah, that's great.
And then you can share your recommendations. So if there are no more questions or no more comments, I think we can end this masterclass here. Catherine, once again, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and for being here with us today. And thank you all to all of you for joining us and for participating. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you again soon, perhaps in another masterclass. Thank you, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Bye.